page here, and we're good to go as soon as you're ready. Are you able to turn your camera on?
Yes, I will be. Just give me a few seconds.
Sure. Take your time, inshallah. No problem. In the meantime, inshallah, as we're waiting for the people to just trickle in, and also as we're just getting settled in with our esteemed guest speaker, we will I'd like to welcome you all. Take this opportunity to welcome you all to this series on the reality of God. This is actually the lecture on the reality of God. This is first lecture, inshallah, that we're doing in the series of lectures, hosting scholars and thinkers and academics from around the world. Alhamdulillah, we're able to do this virtually, and we're able to come together virtually in these difficult times, and this allows us to reinvigorate ourselves, reacquaint ourselves with learning, and it really allows us to I think the opportunity to benefit from people that otherwise it would be tough for us to invite them to our communities it's a blessing, alhamdulillah. All those things we are trying to take advantage of now, and so this is the first lecture series in that aspect, and we're very, very happy, very pleased to have very special guests. Our first guest, inshallah, of the series is Sheikh Abdullah Al-Andalusi. He is based out of London, UK. I think his camera was on for a little bit, and now it's maybe he's fixing something. The Sheikh Abdullah Andalusi, he is a thinker, a speaker, a debater. He has authored books on the topic of books and essays on the topic of theology. His a little bit about him is that he is someone, his work focuses on explaining and demonstrating by rational argument the intellectual proofs for the Islamic belief system, and on promoting the Islamic way of life and Islamic solutions for contemporary problems. He is of Portuguese and French North African descent, formerly a Christian until he embraced Islam at 14 after a period of study that started when he was 10 years old. And he has gone on, mashallah, since to give lectures around the world. Alhamdulillah, he's actually visited Toronto as well, and has given a very famous, participated in a very famous lecture debate at Oxford. Actually, a few at Oxford, alhamdulillah. But the one I'm referring to is with Brother Muhammad Hijab, that I think has gained a lot of fame. And I personally have benefited a lot from his speeches, his take on how we explain the truth, the reality around us, in light of the Quran and Sunnah, in light of logical evidences. Alhamdulillah, so it's a real honor, a real pleasure for us to have him with us. Alhamdulillah. Shaykh Abdullah, you're alhamdulillah, I see your camera. I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself, and I'm going to make you the spotlight video here, inshallah.
Okay, inshallah. Right.
You're okay to go now, right?
Yeah, khair, inshallah.
All right, I'm going to unmute myself and you take it away.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الصلاة والسلام نبي كريم محمد وعلى طيبين وصحبه صالحين السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. To all my Canadian brothers and sisters, around the world who might be joining, apologies for me swigging some energy drinks, but it's a little late and I want to just keep myself perky until the end of this presentation. So Barakallahu feekum to the London Muslim Mosque, which for many people who are not from Canada, there are 2 Londons, maybe even more Londons, who knows. And they also in Canada, a place I miss quite a lot, including, but not limited to, Tim Hortons. So that's, and if I was there, I wouldn't be having an energy drink. I'd be having a probably a French vanilla coffee. Of course, the manly thing would be what's it called, a dark coffee with no milk, just straight up, as that's the manly coffee. But anyway, that's the official version. Anyway, so Jazakallah khairan for inviting me, and inshallah, the kind of the topic which I'd like to discuss is the reality of God, but it would encompass more than just discussion of whether God exists or not. I was asked about to do this event on the back of my opening presentation at the Oxford Union debate held at Oxford University, which was last year. There are the famous or infamous debate, depending on your perspective. And it was I was asked to go a bit more in depth into my opening presentation. And I now I don't really like obviously talking about my Riva experience, because I think that there's obviously millions of people reverting every year, alhamdulillah, with much more interesting stories than myself. My kind of story was quite droll and humdrum kind of approach to just encountering the truth. It was just searching for the truth. But subhanAllah, I'll start at the beginning anyway, and I use it as a template to model just pursuing the truth, generally asking questions. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that I was always perfectly rational. There was so many assumptions that I have made, assumptions that I'm still getting rid of and still discovering in myself. I've often discovered that whenever the universe doesn't make sense, or even when I read some hadith or verse of Quran that doesn't initially make sense, it's always due to some assumption buried in me that I've made about the text, some baggage that I brought into the text, or my baggage I brought into, let's say, reading about science and the observable universe, that causes me to have this misunderstanding or to view it as a conflict, right? So one of the things I try to advise many Muslims and even non-Muslims is that they shouldn't confuse their assumptions with somehow some irrationality in either their religion or in the universe. And I just give you a little example for this. Well, so I mean, this will be covered in an upcoming kind of a course that I'm doing for the Quran Institute on so Dawah Masterclass, and in essence, it distills kind of my 20 years of experience into this kind of 10-week course. But it's one of the segments in that course is dealing with quantum mechanics and the Copenhagen interpretation, which has been much often used and abused to argue that at the fundamental level or deep down in this universe, things don't make sense. Right? Things are just irrational. That contradictions occur. Retrocausality is possible, as in things can cause themselves. And often I try to clear up for people, including people who obviously are criticizing theism, who often resort to what I call the argument from irrationality. And then again, not only them, people who are defending any kind of irrational doctrine will always run to this, to the current ignorance in quantum mechanics and say, oh, well, there's a fundamental contradiction in the universe. For example, how comes you have quantum entanglement to kind of particles which are entangled if you let's say measure the spin on one or affect its kind of its behavior or what it's doing, you will also affect something that is far away, faster than the speed of light, which is meant to be impossible due to Einstein. And it's not, and we are used to the kind of Newtonian understanding where one particle has to be next to another particle and they somehow interact. Usually with the interaction is based on their forces, electromagnetic force and strong and weak force. But electromagnetic force for the most part, and this effect has to be in proximity, one particle next to the other. So then people would say, this shows that fundamentally in the universe, there's cause and effect without what we understand as cause and effect. And so therefore, causality is out the window. And therefore, you don't need, it's pointless to discuss causality of the universe or everything that exists, because surely causality has been refuted by what we've observed from quantum mechanics. And I simply point out that, well, no, it hasn't been kind of negated, because the very fact that if you affect one particle and at a distance it affects another one, so because you affected this particle in some way, shape or form, you cause a change in the state of another particle, that's cause and effect, right? all that's been shown is that the understanding of what is proximity on the quantum level may be different, or the universe might be connected in some way that we just don't know, but it's perfectly within line of causality, right? It's just a speculation by certain overzealous and enthusiastic individuals who take these experimental results and then start to concoct these, eccentric models, or argue that, oh, this goes against intuition, therefore the universe is irrational. And I say, well, it's not. It goes against your assumption, your usually Newtonian-based assumption of how things work in the universe. But I mean, in the medieval ages, if you said to somebody, hey, if you did some action here and it would affect something, far away, they'd say, yeah, of course, we're used to that understanding. Maybe it's magic, right? Magic does that, right? And it's part of the universe. It's magic is part of something, affecting something in the universe, and that's just normal. Okay, and that's part of causality. Magic would be part of causality. If someone in the medieval world might say that. Whereas they wouldn't say, oh, well, because you could do magic spells at a distance, this proves causality. Well, no one would say that or argue that. And of course, certainly when the ancient Greeks used to think that the planets revolve around the Earth, and they would revolve around in perfect orbits, because if something's going to go around, then you think circular orbits, right? They think it's a perfect shape, circular orbits. But the problem with this, circular orbit understanding is that it doesn't match the observable, obviously, reality. The planets don't appear to be in the positions predicted by the model of circular orbits, right? But they appear to us to be going around, so to speak, as in, they seem to come up off the horizon, from the west, and then, from the east and come back in the west. I mean, these kind of things are observed. So how did they explain it? Did the Greeks just say, oh, well, the universe is just irrational and contradictory, and contradiction is possible, so, let's just throw out logic or throw out rationality? Well, no. They didn't know why it was presenting results they couldn't understand with their current models, but they knew that there must have been some explanation. They just don't know it just yet. And of course, later on, we have Kepler talking about elliptical orbits, and of course, the heliocentric model is presented to show that the heavenly bodies all revolve around the sun, with the exception of the moon, of course. And this is just this is obviously now accepted as science. No one would say that this is proves that the universe is counterintuitive. No, it's counter assumptions, right? The universe is counter your assumptions. And the same, when I'm advising Muslims who are facing, shubahat, doubts about Islam, it's always an assumption they made about Islam or religion. I remember once, many times when people say, they would talk about Islam and they'll say, the Quran is preserved, every letter of it is preserved, right, from the time of the Prophet Muhammad. And they say, well, wait a second. The Arabic language wasn't standardized. In fact, the Quran actually helped to standardize the Arabic language. There was no agreed spelling convention at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, but between all the Arabic speakers of Arabia, who it was an oral culture, it wasn't a written culture. I mean, sure, they could write, but they had different areas of Arabia had different conventions on how to spell the same word, for example. So this kind of overzealousness led to people inserting assumptions, and then when they discovered that, well, there are variations in spelling of the same word of old manuscripts in Quran, it starts to impact them. And I say, well, why are you impacted by this? You made the assumption that somehow the Arabic language was standardized prior to the Quran, and then every letter of the Quran was preserved when there was no agreed spelling convention from the outset anyway, between all the different dialects of Arabic that was spoken in Arabia. So, but then a written version became standardized, and that's what we use. But what we are interested in, of course, is that what the Prophet Muhammad related to the Sahaba, which wasn't abrogated by memory and wasn't abrogated by, and Allah SWT did not abrogate these verses, but verses that were intended to be passed down, that all these verses that were intended to be passed down, that the Prophet Muhammad certainly intended to be passed back down, reach us. And on that, we don't have there's no doubt about that. So what we have is the Quran as intended by the Rasulullah SAW. But to argue that every letter is preserved from the Quran, it just really misunderstands history and the Arabic language at the time in 7th century Arabia. So this is just my example of assumptions are the problem, the root of all human misunderstanding. And again, it reminded me of something I saw. There was this medieval documentary called Inside the Medieval Mind. It was produced in England, and they were talking about in Europe, people were speculating on the possibility. In fact, they started to believe a rumor that there were dog-headed humans, right? So, well, maybe not fully human, but they had the body of human beings, but the heads of dogs. And there was all these pictures, illustrations. There was theological discussions about whether they have souls, whether they can be saved by Jesus, and so on and so on and so forth. It's all this discussion about it, and it seemed obviously completely irrational to ourselves. But what the kind of the narrator and the producer of the show was kind of made an interesting point, and what they were trying to show is that they said the people in medieval Europe, Western Europe, weren't any less rational than we are today. It was just their starting assumptions, right? Well, people are rational based on the assumptions that they are working off of, right? They always think, okay, well, how do I create the maximum, achieve my interests, or do the most logical thing or rational thing on the basis of these starting premises, okay? And that is, I think, the root of all falsehood is assumptions. And sometimes, and the worst falsehoods, and why they become assumptions, is because they're mixed with a little bit of truth. So all falsehood is mixed with a little bit of truth to swallow that pill. So in essence, since before I obviously became Muslim, I was inculcated with so many assumptions about how reality is, about what truth would look like, what a cosmic truth would look like. Buddhism and Buddhist philosophy was kind of quite popular in the West. It probably still is in some areas. And this idea of, certainly when you see these movies where, you have this hero and they have to go on a quest to reflect and meditate and discover the truth, like when they're 60 or 80 years old or something. And only then they discover the truth after reflection and meditation. And then they reach some kind of enlightenment, right? And because the truth, or the point of this enlightenment, is to find this hidden truth is very hard to find, but you can only find it through intense reflection that takes decades. This was sold to us as, well, if you want to know the purpose of life, that's the purpose of, that's how you find it. It's like, it's too long-winded. It's probably, we'll never agree on it. We'll never find it. It's unknowable even. That was another assumption that was fed to me as a young kid, that the purpose of life is actually unknowable. So best live your life, or in essence, live for attaining pleasures that you can get. Attain as much pleasure as you can in life by whatever legal means, of course, you can get it. And in some cases, illegal means like drugs and so on and so forth. That's the kind of messages that was bombarding the youth. So when I initially encountered Islam, it was deceptively simple. It was so simple that I didn't think it could be the truth, because it was just so simple to understand. Because I made the assumption that the truth behind reality has to be something so complex and so hidden that it would require decades and decades of contemplation and meditation to arrive at. But then if you think about it, right, why would the truth require most of a person's life, which people, not everyone can necessarily live that long, most of a person's life to discover, and then only when they maybe reach an advanced age, or now they can live that purpose of life, right? It doesn't seem to make any sense. At least the way that to discover truth was via some gnosis, which is via hidden knowledge that's inside, or that you have to find it deep inside, or from some kind of inspiration that comes many decades into the future. It didn't seem that was that made any sense, and that was practical for human beings. There had to have been something that humans can access a bit earlier. Whether humans have made it accessible is a different question, but there had to have been something that surely should have been accessible from the dawn of humanity. Anyway, So a little bit about my background. It was your bulk standard nominal Anglican Christian. Of course, my mom's side of the family was devout Catholic, but I was really too young to notice the difference between Anglicans and Catholics. Of course, the kind of the Anglican church that I attended follows what we call Anglo-Catholic rites, and so it's the Church of England with a bit of a sprinkling of Catholic rituals and traditions. Not all of it, but a sprinkling of it. So, and so that for me, I really didn't see the difference between the two. But it did seem to dawn upon me when I saw different religions or I heard of different philosophies or different ideas that, well, how do I know that basically I'm following the truth when in essence I was just kind of following the religion of the society that I was in. My father was very secular, and so religion was just basically off the cards for him. And so I just followed being a Christian. Attended mass, took communion, and so on. I didn't understand with any intellectual depth. Maybe later on in life, ironically, I discovered more about Christianity as a Muslim than I did as a Christian. But something seemed to make sense to me as a Christian, that Jesus was not God. In fact, no one really told me. They took me aside and said, "Oh, by the way, did you know that Jesus is God, and he's God in the flesh, came down as an incarnation, and that when he died for your sins, that was literally him dying for your sins." I always thought that was like metaphorical, or when it's referred to as the Son of God, I always thought that was metaphorical. That like he's not actually God, because in the Bible, Jesus is praying to God. Okay, he is speaking to God. He talks about the Father, which was always kind of associated with the God of the Old Testament, and so there was God on this side and Jesus on the other side, so to speak. So as a kid, I would never think that they were the same thing. It just didn't make any sense. And now, obviously, a devout Christian today, or who's learned in theology, would say I was an ignorant and naive Christian. And of course, I would never advance that I was any expert on Christianity just because I was an ex-Christian. As I said, I was a nominal Christian, like most people in many Western countries. But most Christian kids growing up, unless you're a type of Baptist or like a North American kind of Christian, which they're very strong on emphasizing Jesus more than anything else. You wouldn't think that Jesus and God are the same thing. In fact, I once had this very surreal debate, just one-on-one debate with some of my friends in Portugal who are Catholics. When I was, they were just asking about, we were talking about Islam, and they were asking about the differences between Islam and Christianity. And I said, well, one of the things that, we believe in Jesus as the Messiah. We revere him as a great prophet of God and a messenger, but only a human being, right? We don't think he's God. So the Christian guy looks at me and said, like, well, how's that a difference? Because, yeah, of course he's not God. And I'm like, well, yeah, he's not God, but you're a Catholic, right? And he's like, yes. So if you believe that Jesus, you believe that Jesus is God, it's Catholic doctrine to believe that he is God and he's part of a trinity of persons in a united Godhead. And he said that no, the Trinity is just basically the three things that we revere within the creed of Christianity, and Jesus is a human being. He's not God. We don't believe that. Son of God is just like it's a title. And I said, look, I'm really glad that you believe that he's not God, and I don't want to change your mind about this, but it's not accurate to what Catholic doctrine actually teaches. I don't want to win this debate with you. I actually want you to continue believing that he's not God and not adopting that idea. But we had a very solid, strong debate just on what Catholicism believes, because they weren't that conversant with their doctrines, mostly because Christians aren't taught this stuff. But anyway, that aside, I did know that Islam had similar themes to Judaism and Christianity, of course. And since I wasn't sure about whether Christianity had some authenticity to it or authority to it, and I wasn't sure about Judaism either, then of course I'd say, well, I wasn't sure about Islam and so on. So, but then I've always believed in the concept of Jahannam, of hell or punishment, and it wasn't because it was obviously beaten into me as a young kid, so to speak. There was always something with a ring of truth, that there would always be some kind of accountability for the actions of human beings in this life. I mean, you see some people, very good people, are suffering, and some very horrific people seem to be getting a lot of benefits and goods in this life. And it didn't seem fair. It seemed rather, arbitrary. Now, I know what the atheists would say to this, but seeing as that I realized in some basic level that there was something inside me that was observing the world, i.e. non-material, something, maybe you could call it a soul, but there was something inside that was observing the world that can't be explained by material things, that this observer, if it's not material, if it's not part of this universe, then it's going to go, then after the physical body dies, where is this soul going to go? And if human experience of the world are all different, and people can do bad actions or good actions, or actions that cause harm and suffering, and actions that don't, then there always seem to be a kind of a ring of truth to the notion of an accountability for this observer after this physical body dies. And that's why I thought it was just natural to believe in the possibility of a hell. Of course, it scared me, and I'd hoped there wasn't, because I was quite scared of the concept, like any kid would be. But it just seemed to be quite true. So myself, anyway, I made a bit of a bargain, a deal with God, because I always believed in God, even though I might not have always believed the universe was created, which I know it's a contradictory proposition. Because I was reading lots of science, and I bump into materialists discussing science, thinking this is part of scientific discussion, and it wasn't. It was just their speculation from their own assumption, the assumption of naturalism or materialism, that there was this kind of a cyclical nature to the universe, destruction, creation, going back in an infinite past. So I always thought that was a possibility, and maybe I thought that was nice and neat, you don't need anything else to explain it. But even though I actually at the same time believed there was a God, and I know that's kind of, it sounds weird, because then if there was a God and there's a universe that doesn't need to be created, why is there a God then, or what need is there for a God? Of course, Aristotle actually believed something like that, but believed that God provides, or a first mover provides movement, but the universe and God are co-eternal. That's a different discussion anyway. I won't get into that. Anyway, so going back to my point was that I made a deal with God, so to speak. I said, I don't want to go, if there's a hell, I don't want to go to it. I'm very scared of hell. So please don't be angry with me if I'm following the wrong religion, or I end up in the wrong religion. But if you do kind of help me or guide me to the truth, I promise that I will try to share that with as many people as possible. I won't keep it to myself. Basically, I'll try to share that. So that was my deal with God, and to allay my fears of going to hell. I didn't want to go to hell following the wrong religion or falsehood. Now, again, I suppose a skeptic or atheist watching this might say, well, you had assumptions, or you assume God exists. Maybe that was going to presume the inevitable destination of where you were going. That was going to bias your search. But the thing is that I tried to look at every possible philosophy and belief system from its own merits. In essence, I would see each as a story, and I would see if this story by itself can explain all observable reality around me. So I take it as each one as a hypothesis, and I say, how well does this hypothesis match the observation of human existence, animals, inanimate matter, the universe, and so on and so forth. I was a bit of a science buff since I used to read National Geographic, thanks to very generous and kind subscription, and a friend of my mother's got her, so she got a subscription for me, which I'm very grateful for. He gave me a very broad general knowledge from age of 7. This is before Google and the internet, by the way. If yes, that time did exist. There was a time where you couldn't just Google, you couldn't just make yourself a sheikh and Google your answers and your fatwa. There was the time you had to read books in those old fangled places called libraries, which I also frequented and used. And I tried to absorb as much information out of pure curiosity, for the most part, to then build as big a picture of the world as I possibly could, and then test these hypotheses against what I could observe in the universe, in biology, in physics, in natural history, in human history. So there had to be some kind of explanation that would explain all these things, if such explanation existed. And of course, I started all this I started this kind of determined project when I was 10 years old. So as a typical naive 10 years old, I thought that if the purpose of life or the truth behind existence wasn't discovered, or wasn't known, then I would try to discover it, which was a very grandiose, naive thing. But what was the alternative? Me to accept that there is no possibility of understanding my purpose, and I live a purposeless existence, and I could accept that if the hypothesis of naturalism or atheism seemed the most likely explanation, then I would have accepted that. But to accept that I will just not ask a question in the first place, and just blissfully live ignorantly, when what I don't know could hurt me, when I don't know about life could hurt me, when I don't want to waste my life following something that doesn't, or not following what I'm meant to be following, or not looking for the truth, when the truth would surely inform all my decisions, would inform my direction in life. So I then kind of went into an investigation into every possible hypothesis that I could find, and Islam was just one of the many hypotheses. Now I kind of modeled my Dawah masterclass course on that investigation. Of course, not model it on the reading I did as a 10-year-old, of course, but on all the many years since then, more years than I'd care to admit publicly. I based the course on discussing all these possible hypotheses, including fictional ones. Well, arguably everything that's false is fictional, but those which are admittedly fictional, like H.P. Lovecraft, is his fictional understanding of the universe. Was that a possibility, that there's actually evil gods behind the universe, or an evil god behind the universe? Are we living in the Matrix? Are we brains in a vat? Is that a possibility? What could we still know of the truth if that was the situation? And so the course kind of was structured from getting to a point of total skepticism, where how do I even know what I'm experiencing is real, to Islam being the only possible explanation for existence. So I'm going to just kind of go through, again, this is view this as a type of a sharh of my opening presentation at the Oxford debate, a commentary on it, a discussion on it. There's not enough time for me to discuss why Islam was first the best hypothesis, and then I eventually came to the understanding it was the only possible hypothesis, the only possible explanation for the universe. But I'll get to maybe just understanding, how do we know at least there is a creator, and how do we know that the creator created everything and even cares about us, or even knows about us, which is deism. How do we know these things? So I used 4 arguments in the debate, and they are, again, deceptively simple, but they're based on tried and tested, about 20 years of me refining the best way of kind of phrasing these arguments. Now, one of the many problems that people encounter when they do apologetics is, one, they think that they have to, when I say apologetics, I mean defense of Islam or their religion, is they assume that to make an effective argument for God's existence, you have to know modern science. And they also think that you have to study logic and advanced propositional logic and all the formulations of cosmological arguments. Cosmological from the Greek cosmos, meaning obviously everything that exists, and ology, which means an account of, and accounting for everything that exists. So they think you have to study these very formulaic logical arguments, and you don't. You could explain the existence of God to a child, and that God has a will, and not God created everything, to a child with very basic rationality. What made it more complex, the need for arguments, is that you'd have skeptics who'd come along, and they would try to use or attempt to introduce ambiguities to confound what is essentially a very basic argument. So in essence, you could tell a child that everything that exists, was it there before you were born? And so, well, obviously the child would say, well, of course it must have been, because I didn't make it, so I'm not the creator. So, and if you're not the creator of everything that exists, then there must be something else beyond what you can experience, which is the creator of everything that exists. And again, the child would say, yes, of course. And then you could simply argue to the child that if this has been going on forever, right? Would there ever be? If there was a history that went on for eternity and that was infinite in the past, would we ever get here? Like if I said that this lecture will end after an infinite amount of time, or before it began, if the Sheikh said that this lecture will begin, and Abdullah's just taking time to fix his camera, but it will begin after an infinite amount of time, then we start the lecture. Well, would the lecture ever begin? No, it wouldn't. And so then a child would understand that, there was a start point to everything. And the child would at least understand that if the child's first experience of existence is their own intelligence, then surely there is something greater than themselves, which an intelligence that caused this start point to occur. Because if it was something else and that didn't have intelligence, then what is making that begin the universe? If it's a mechanical clock that creates the universe, then surely this mechanical clock, what wound it up or began its process. And if you said it had an infinite process in the past, we get right back to infinity in the past problems, which obviously brings us right back to that contradiction. So the only thing that the kid knows is that the kid can initiate things by their choice, and so everything that they can observe was initiated by a higher choice of a higher intelligence, quote unquote. And a kid can understand that. It makes perfect sense to a kid. I think many of you growing up as Muslims probably never experienced any crisis of faith due to the contradictions in Islamic theology, because there isn't any contradictions in Islamic theology. You don't have a Trinity to contend with. God has three persons, but he's one God. But each person has his own will, but it's all the same God. And each of these persons, the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, has infinite power, its own will, but they're all part of the same God. How would that be different from three gods? Because in three gods, you'd have each God having their own will, infinite power, and how's that different from the idea of the Trinity? Well, it's exactly the same. So how's that one God? That doesn't make sense. The idea of original sin, that every child is born with the sin of Adam, alayhi salam, and therefore every child deserves to be punished in hell just because they bear sin, because all sin must be punished by death according to Christian doctrine. These produce endless shubahat and the need for compartmentalization in the minds of young Christians. Of course, what usually happens is that young Christians aren't taught this idea, so they just think Jesus is not God, he's just a man, and like myself, right? And therefore, that's the only way not to experience these contradictions. But you were, alhamdulillah, blessed with not growing up with trying to reconcile these kind of problems. But that being said, the downside to that is that many Muslims don't question their beliefs and why they believe what they believe, and instead while they will believe in Islam, but they won't question a very simple thing, which is, well, in your life, your parents will teach you that you have certain rites of passage, certain cultural values you have to uphold. These cultural values come from society, they don't come from God. But you have to follow these cultural values. You have to wave the right flag, the right colors that represents the right area of land that you live in. That you have to uphold the family honor, and you have to uphold the honor of your locale. Then your locale gets other locales, and then your country and other countries, and your ethnicity against other ethnicity, and so on and so forth. Now, a lot of the Muslims will just think this is normal, and you should have a family and get, be as rich as you can, and so on and so forth, and then have kids, and then once your kids are raised to maintain the family reputation, then you can die, and that's fine. And that's your life. That's all you're meant to be doing. Oh, but by the way, while you're doing all this, just make sure you check all the tick boxes of this thing called Islam. That's on the side. Just check all the tick boxes. Make sure you do your namaz, your salah, and so on, and fast on that month when you're meant to, and do that one Hajj, and so on and so forth. Just make sure you do that along with this other way of life you're living, and you should be good, right? That's all you have to do. So as opposed to the more rational kind of approach, which is, well, wait a second. If we have a purpose of life, and that purpose of life is ordained by the Creator, who made everything in this universe, then surely my entire life would revolve around that. There'd be nothing other than what the Creator has told us to live by, because nothing else has any meaning. Nothing else has any value. I shouldn't be looking at what's good for my country, because what I call my country is not eternal, doesn't exist, doesn't actually physically exist. It represents more, it's closer to a religion than it is to an actual real existence. It's just a part of a changing Earth's crust. So it's a little area on the Earth's crust that you've designated at that moment in time, because it wasn't always there, and it was changing from different continents sliding onto each other, and so on and so forth. And at that little brief speck of dust in this universe, and a speck of dust on a speck of dust, that is something that you should live and fight and die for. That doesn't seem to make any sense. Surely that, if God intended the nation to be eternal, then he wouldn't make the earth change. He wouldn't make nations change and politics change, and so on and so forth. That wouldn't make any sense. So, although Muslims are born into Islam today, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are devoid of assumptions that have been inculcated into them at a young age. And I also can make another caveat, which is, I think that any Muslim who's come to the realization that Islam is the truth, it's the way of life, and it's the only measuring stick for good and bad, and is the only lens by which they should look at the world, I would consider them to be a revert, whether they came from a non-Muslim background or from a Muslim background. The thinking process is exactly the same, right? To get to that conclusion is exactly the same. Right? They question, they challenge, they look into things, and they will reach whereas a non-Muslim has to break free of ways of life which are overtly non-Islamic and overtly belief systems and maybe creeds which are different. The Muslim has to break through a way of life which is currently called culture. They have to break through this set of assumptions to come to Islam. So I don't view it as any different. A Muslim who's come to that realization from a non-Muslim background or from a Muslim background, they're both exactly the same in thinking process. So anyway, let's get on to, I suppose, just to discuss the four arguments I used for kind of the proof of God, as it were. Now, as I said, you don't. Sometimes people listen to me discussing this and they think, well, Abdullah's not using too much jargon, too much philosophical jargon. He's not constructing arguments using a logical form. Logic is a set of, especially propositions, syllogisms, like propositions, structured propositions, which are really just assertions like all men are mortal, proposition 1. So proposition 2, Socrates is a man, therefore conclusion, Socrates is mortal. So you think, well, that makes sense. Why can't you use logic, right? Logic is surely, who'd have a problem with that structuring that Aristotle came up with in his book called Analytica, which means to complete or to solve. He didn't call it logic. Logic is just a word in Greek for well, many things, but like knowledge, word, and so on and so forth. Anyway, well, the thing is this. Imagine you were debating a hyper-skeptic, right? So somebody who just wants not to admit that Socrates is mortal, right? Let's just say, right? It's someone who's anti-Socrates being mortal. And you bring that simple logic. They'll say, okay, well, you know, all men are mortal. They say, oh, wait. How do you know all men are mortal? By men, I mean human beings there, right? So in case Trudeau comes in and says, what do you mean only men? So how do you know all humans are mortal? Have you spoken to every human being? Have you encountered every human being? Maybe there's like a human being that hasn't died yet and will never die, perhaps. How do you know that all human beings are mortal? And I say, okay, well, all right, fine. Look, can we at least agree that Socrates is a man? Well, no, we can't, they'd say. Socrates could have been an alien. It could have been a jinn, or some spirit of some kind. How do you know that Socrates is human, let alone, how do you even know Socrates even existed? Did you meet him personally? And that was the Socrates that everyone was referring to? Well, you didn't. So we don't know if Socrates is a man. So we can't, or human, right? We can't say for certain. So the conclusion that Socrates is mortal, they can say, I reject that. You have not proved it to me. You haven't proved it to absolute certainty. Now, here's the thing, right? This simple logic is taken as the basic illustration of a deductive argument in logic, or something that would be certain. You think it would be certain. So what logicians tend to do is they say, if all the premises were true, then the conclusion follows. That's what they say. So if all the premises are true, then the conclusion follows. Logic is just about preventing self-contradictory arguments. It was never about demonstrating the truth with absolute certainty of the arguments, which is why I don't use logic. I use rationality, and rationality is different because logic starts out with assertions. Rationality starts out with observation, and then you try to build a possible explanation for what you observe. That's basic rationality. It's what detectives do. It's what doctors do when they try and diagnose your illness. Most of the time, it can only give probabilistic, conclusions, like uncertain conclusions, but grades of relative certainty, or at least probability. But there is one thing, apart from like 2 + 2 = 4. There's one thing I would say is the only thing we can know for certain. And that is that God exists. And you don't know if you're in the matrix or not, but I can prove for certain that God exists. So, and I did it based on these 4 arguments. So the arguments in the debate which I presented was the argument for change, or from change, the argument from the origin of finitude or finite things, the argument from the origin of specificity, and the argument from divisibility or substance, let's just say. And these correlate to, well, it wasn't intentional, but I suppose Aristotle's 4 causes, where, he'd say there's an efficient cause, so something that began something into existence is called an efficient cause. A material cause is what something is made out of, so that's the material cause. Then you have, of course, well, he called it a teleological cause, which is basically what something is moving towards. But in this case, I argued what something, the initial movement or change behind all things, and the other type of cause, which is the cause of the form, right? Cause from its form. So what gives the form? What determined the form of a thing? Now, to kind of, let's say, if I'm going to use an analogy, so the efficient cause, let's say, behind a cake is the cook, right? The cook is making the cake. He's the efficient, or she is the efficient cause. The material cause behind the cake is the ingredients used to make the cake. The teleological cause is what the cake was meant for, to be eaten, for example, to be at a birthday party or something like this. And the material, yeah, and the cause that determined its form is the recipe, right? So what determined its form was the recipe that the cake was going to be made into. So in a way, this parallels Aristotle's kind of discussion of four causes. It's just the four possible causes you can see for anything you observe. So let's start with change, right? It's very basic. Whether what you are observing is in the matrix or not, or whether you actually are observing the real world or reality, right? There is something that all these observations can agree on, which is your observations or experiences are changing. Change is happening. You call it time. Time is just change. That's all it is. And so the question is, if things are changing, and so you have sequential events, you're in a current now, and there's a past and there's a future, regardless of how you understand this, but there is change. There is something that was one way and then now another way. So there is something change. So the question is, how far does this go back? Right? How far does change go back into the past? Right? Now, if you say, as a skeptic would argue, that maybe change is eternal. It has an eternal past. There's an eternal past, an infinite past of changes. Well, as I pointed out in my earlier on in this discussion, that if there was an eternal past of change, we would never get here, because you would have to exhaust, so complete, an infinite number of moments or changes to reach this point. But the definition of infinity is it's basically unfinishable, inexhaustible. So it produces a contradiction, which is you're saying you're exhausting the inexhaustible to get to this point. This means there was a start point. There has to be a start point. And sometimes the atheist or the skeptic would say, are you saying that that universe, this universe started the Big Bang? You never saw what happened in the Big Bang? I said, look, I didn't bring science into this. Scientific speculation. I didn't bring that into this. You brought it. I'm just talking rationally that there can't be an infinite past. Whether there were 6 Big Bangs and big crunches, or 10 or 100 Big Bangs and big crunches, explosions, and then the universe kind of collapsing on itself, if that's what was going to happen. I didn't speculate any of them. I didn't speculate any of this. I didn't speculate how big the universe is. I didn't speculate how old it is, and by universe I mean everything that exists. Because if this universe came from a Big Bang that came from a prior set of conditions in a bigger or a smaller universe, this would also be part of the universe, right? So I didn't make any speculation. You make the speculation. I only said that there can't be an infinite past. So then now the question is, if there's a start point, what's causing this start point, right? Where's it coming from? So they would argue every other possibility they could, which is naturalistic or materialist. They'd say maybe it came from absolute nothing, which obviously is completely absurd, because absolute nothing won't generate anything in of itself. So okay, maybe not that. Maybe it was created by something else that's also material. Well, we're right back to an infinite regress then, going back into the past of an infinite chain of things causing each other. We already established that there has to be a start point of something that's not part of this chain, right? As in it's not been caused or what have you. It is making the cause. They say, well, maybe the universe caused itself, a retrocausality, and they'll try to bring some quantum mechanics speculations. But again, that's ridiculous, and it falls foul of what is called the bootstrap paradox, which I think is from the idea of, if you were to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you couldn't lift yourself off the ground, right? By pulling your boots, you'll just lift your leg closer to your torso, but you wouldn't be able to lift yourself off the ground. So the bootstrap paradox. It's circular, and it doesn't answer anything, right? So relative to the ground, you're not moving just by pulling your bootstraps up. So it's circular, and in essence, circular causality is another infinite regress, right? It's just an infinite regress where the thing that came before this is the beginning of, or is the end of the previous iteration of this universe in a circular cycle going back into the past. It's just not an infinite regress. And again, yeah, if you had to wait for an infinite amount of rotations or retro causalities to get to this point in time, you never reach this point in change or time. So ultimately, then the thing, it can't be retro causality, so, or self-causing. So in essence, the only possibility that's left is that you have something that isn't caused, that caused the universe to exist. Let's say, okay, well, even if they'll say, even if we accept that, how do you know it's God? How do you jump straight to saying it's God then? They'll say, well, look, what can we know about this thing that initiates change, okay? So if this thing gets from a point of absolute, let's say, you know, so there's a universe, so there's no universe existing, right? No change occurring. So in a way, it's like at zero movement, zero change. And then it can increase from zero change to some change to something from a point of complete rest or nothing, right? Or like stop or rest or no change, basically, is what I'm referring to. And then initiates change. This demonstrates to us two things. One, if it can initiate change from nothing, from no change, then it can, in essence, it is increasing from nothing. I call it increase from nothing. That there's nothing, and then it can increase, it can add something to nothing. And if it can add something to nothing, then in essence, it creates ex nihilo, as they call it in Latin, from nothing. It can create from nothing. And if something can create from nothing, then it is by definition infinite, i.e. of inexhaustible power. The power of this thing can't be exhausted if it can initiate from nothing. It can initiate something from nothing, initiate change from a state of there being no change. So people call this infinite power, if you want to use that term, but in essence, it's inexhaustible power, which agrees with the Quran's description in that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't deplete himself or get tired by creating or doing as he pleases. He doesn't lose anything, so he's of inexhaustible power. Power just means, to use the physics, it's basically work done over unit time, per unit time, but it basically means getting work done. So the ability to get work done, to do things, right? That's what power is in essence, to affect things. So infinite power. But then, okay, well, infinite power, but how do you know it's not mindless, right? This thing, when I say mindless, I don't mean has a human mind, of course. What we mean is has a will, right? Irada in Arabic, a will, a choice, intent. Well, the question is, what made this thing initiate change in the first place? Why did it initiate change in the first place? What's making it? So if they would argue there's an internal mechanism inside it, or it's being pressured to by an external thing to make universes, such like they'd argue a type of multiverse might be. There's a multiverse that makes universes mindlessly. But the question is, what is causing this multiverse to make universes from nothing, mindlessly? What is making it do so? Why is it doing so? If you're saying there's something external is pressuring it to do it, prodding it to make, then this multiverse isn't the cause, isn't the first cause. It's this thing that's prodding it to do it. Then what's causing that? And then you go into an infinite regress of what's causing that to initiate change. So that can't be the case. Maybe it's an internal mechanism. So maybe it's an internal mechanism that makes the multiverse make universes. But then the question is, where's this mechanism? What's making this mechanism make universes? It's like me getting a watch and explaining to you that the watch, the hands on the watch move because there's an infinite chain of internal mechanism that's making the watch move its hands. We'll say that's great, but if you're saying there's an infinite chain of an internal mechanism the hands are moved by smaller hands, by smaller hands, by smaller hands, by smaller springs and smaller springs and smaller springs and smaller springs. If there's no start point to this initiating this mechanism, then the hands wouldn't move, because you'd have to wait for an infinite amount of mechanisms to move before the clock hands move on the clock. So you wouldn't get any movement, in essence, right? It would be an infinite regress problem. So then what's left, right? Well, what's left is that the only thing that's making this first creator, mover, the initiator of change, initiate things from nothing is choice. In fact, I dare say free will and intent, a will that not even we possess, because we are limited to two choices presented to ourselves. And even then, we depend on this creator to give us to facilitate us to make a choice. But this creator has true free choice, because unlike us, let's say for example, if you're a new Muslim and you come from a background like I did, where there's pork eating is a big thing in Iberia, and obviously it's haram when you become Muslim. Of course, when it's haram, always haram, but you become aware of it being haram when you become Muslim. But you're feeling hungry, and your family are presenting you with pork products, and the alternative is just vegetables. And let's say you're not really big into vegetables, as I was when I was younger, you would get that temptation, right? But you know that you should eat the vegetables and not eat the pork. But when you just become a Muslim, obviously you have this habit of your aversion to pork hasn't developed just yet, so it becomes tempting initially when you're hungry. Now, without that hunger, you wouldn't be tempted either way. Your free will depends on you having a motivational force you didn't choose that allows you the opportunity to steer your boat, so to speak, one direction or the other. But without that wind in your sails, without that motivational force, you wouldn't make those choices, because you wouldn't be pushed into either way, left or right, so to speak. Whereas this creator, if it can initiate from nothing purely based on its will, then its will is truly free, as in it doesn't have instincts that it has to obey or satisfy. It initiates purely out of choice, out of intent. And if something has inexhaustible power and has intent or choice, then this satisfies the minimum definition of what is conventionally called in English language God, right? Although you can pick any word you want from any language you like, Dieu, Theos in Greek if you want, or in Hindi, Bhagwan possibly, but I wouldn't advise it, possibly due to connotations with certain Hindu religious concepts. But if there is a word in Hindi that just means God and is not associated with any of the pagan idols, well, then it shouldn't be any more problematic than Allah was for the pagan Arabs, who already knew about the word Allah and knew that Allah was beyond their pagan idols and so on and so forth. But my point is that whatever word you want to call this thing, up to you, depending on your language. Someone said Khuda, which is Persian and Urdu, I believe, right? That's not the issue. Isn't these titles? Of course, if you're going to, once you follow Revelation, it would be wise to follow, obviously, the words suggested by Revelation. But I'm saying until you get to that point, it doesn't matter what word you use. So throughout history, any human being, and there's been many, who believes in one God, and a God that doesn't resemble finite things, because surely if something is uncreated, then where does it form? Where would its form come from? And how would it be a limited finite thing when it's something that is not limited? It's infinite in power. How can it be limited, and how can it have a form as like a human being or an animal when it was uncreated? And so, but these things have a form because the form comes from something that formed it, which leads to my second argument, which is the argument for finite things, or the argument for finitude, which is if everything you observe even if you were in the matrix, right, and you saw anything, a program, okay, you would see something that has boundaries, a shape, certain limited attributes and characteristics. I sometimes like to, I always forget to do anything lectures, but I should keep a rock on hand. I sometimes in my lectures I brought to, at university, I'd bring a little rock, and I would say, not for throwing at people, of course, who ask me tricky questions, but to demonstrate, I said, how do you know that this rock was created? Right? How do you know that it is not eternal? Right? How do you know it's not an eternal rock? People might say, I've seen rocks being formed on geological documentaries or in diagrams, geologists explain it like this. So, well, that's great, but you never saw where this particular rock came from. So how do you know this rock, this hypothetical rock I'm holding, so to speak, how do you know that it was created? Now, intuitively, there's something in the human mind, in the fitra, that's rational, and that would say, well, why does a rock have a certain shape and a certain size and a certain weight, right? I mean, if the rock could be anything it wanted, why is it, then its original form wouldn't be a rock then, surely, but this rock thing shape that you're seeing, that seems to be part of this rock is a certain limit, right? It was at some point determined to be at the limits that it has, the shape that it has. So the question is whether either the rock made itself or the rock didn't make itself. So let's go with the first possibility, the rock made itself. If the rock made itself, what this means is the rock could determine. So firstly, the rock would have to exist to make itself, which is absurd. So then people say maybe the rock didn't make itself, it was always existing. Then the question would be, if it's always existing, then why does it have the certain shape, form that it has? So the argument is, well, it has the shape and form that it has because the rock decided that it would have that particular shape and form. Then in essence, the rock isn't actually finite because it can decide anything, any effect it causes. And then of course, then the rock wouldn't actually be eternal anyway, because that appearance of form was created by whatever created that rock. So in essence, it wouldn't be the rock itself that was even the creator of itself, because the form would have to have been formed by something, and it can't be the form in itself. To better explain it would be, if the rock could decide its limits, it would be unlimited, and therefore, if it is unlimited, then it wouldn't have limits, and it wouldn't eternally have limits. So the only possibility that's left is that the rock didn't create itself, and its limits were defined by an external process, or external to it, that defined its limitations. And that can be done on anything finite. So ultimately then, the question is, well, where did this finite thing come from? It came from something else that was finite. Okay, what then determined that? Its finitude, or something else. And eventually you have to get to a point where you find something that didn't originate, its limits or attributes didn't come from outside itself, but it actually, it defines its own effects. It defines its own power, and therefore is not limited, not finite. You couldn't see it, and it itself can create or decide any power or any effect it wants to do, which in essence would be, for example, creating, and upon which all things would depend on, because it would be defining all things that need to be defined and can't define themselves. So that's the argument from kind of finitude, which I suppose I made it more simpler before, but it's some people can call it the argument from contingency, but that's just that's another term for it, but that's fine. And then the other argument is, well, people might say, maybe, look, these things that you observe, they're made of components, right? They're not like fundamental. They're made of atoms or molecules and atoms, and then subatomic particles going all the way down to quarks, and maybe something even more fundamental like fluctuations in quantum vacuum or superstrings, which are all superstrings obviously speculated to exist, not proven, of course. That's fine. I'm not arguing, what's the smallest thing, but my point is, take the smallest thing that they suppose exists. Why does it have its attributes? Right? Where does it come from? So we know that the rock would have attributes because it comes from the material it's made out of, the material quartz. Okay, that's fine. So what's that made out of? Okay, well, you get down to molecules, you get down to atoms, you get down to subatomic particles, down to quarks, and maybe possibly superstrings or what have you. Fine, but what is giving these superstrings, for the sake of argument, is all this really small particle? Maybe there's like 10 more levels of smaller particle underneath that. What's giving the smallest particle, the smallest building block, its attributes, right? If you say, well, something else that it's made out of, its components give it its attribute, well, then you can ask the question, well, what is that made out of? So in essence, what's it all made out of? You have to reach a point where you reach a fundamental level where you can't go beyond any further, because otherwise it'd be infinite regress. You can't say that matter can be divided up infinitely, because if that was the case, then matter wouldn't exist, because infinite amount of divisions mean that there is nothing substantial at all. There is no fundamental building blocks in the universe, which means that nothing would exist. So there must be this fundamental building block. Okay, what is giving this fundamental building block its characteristics that it can be used as a component to be attached to other things and built up into bigger structures? Well, either it comes from itself or it comes from something else. All right, sorry, the screen is changed. Yeah, sorry. Either it comes from itself or something else. So if the smallest building block possible, if it attributes comes from itself, meaning it projects its own effects, its energy, it projects its own power, and it's not made of anything inside it. There's no finite reservoir of energy in it. It projects power as the beginning point of power. It can just project it. Then it's inexhaustible. It would be infinite in essence, right? And then the question is, why is it only projecting power only to that limited level, the size of a building block, right? If you take a Lego, why is that the smallest possible Lego that size? Well, you say, well, it's that size because whatever is making it that size that made it that size, formed to be that size, right? Fine. So if you take the smallest building block and you say that it has infinite power, then it wouldn't be a small or a building block. So ultimately, then its power must come from something else outside itself. All the building blocks, the smallest building blocks in this universe, must have its power supplied to it, or its attributes given to it by something else. And the fact that the universe doesn't seem to be in chaos and confliction means that the power source that is sustaining all these building blocks is one, which coheres with a verse of the Quran that says, if there had been more than one creator, one God, then you would have seen kind of the universe, to paraphrase, in chaos, as each creator changes the laws of the universe according to its own independent and separate will. The fact that you have regularities in the universe shows that everything is being sustained by one sustainer. Right, and there's no other explanation, unless you're saying that every building block, the fundamental building block, is infinite. It can create its own power inexhaustibly, and then you'd have a universe of a universe of gods. But then how comes they all limited and follow regularities and laws? Is only because these fundamental building blocks are limited, but they need then a source for their power, a source for their attributes, and this attribute, it has to come outside themselves to sustain it. That's why, and this agrees with the Islamic concept that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the sustainer. He doesn't just create the universe and then the universe doesn't need him anymore, but he actively is continuing to sustain its existence, and that can be deduced, rationally. Otherwise, the only way to avoid an infinite regress of substances, of smaller and smaller building blocks that goes into nothing, and nothing would exist. So there has to be a fundamental layer of reality which can't be broken down further, and then its attributes must come from whatever is sustaining giving these things these attributes, because these things don't give themselves their attributes. Otherwise, they would be infinite of power. And lastly, the fourth argument, the argument from specificity, which is not just a mouthful, but also an argument which is really the argument for where did the choice of things come from. So it's similar to the argument that everything is finite, and finite things need to be created. Their limitations need to be drawn, right? A circle, if you draw a circle, you've made a circle by defining its limits, right? That's what, so finite things need to be limited or defined into existence. So, but that's, I've already argued that in the second argument, but the argument for specificity is, where did the choice for the things to be the way they are come from? So how comes this universe doesn't have one more quark than it does, or one less quark than it does? How comes you have the universe with this very specific laws and attributes and an amount of energy and the rate of expansion and all this in a very specific way? Now, of course, an atheist or materialist would argue, well, these things are caused by, we would argue these things were determined by the prior set of conditions to this universe. So whatever was before this universe, whatever the conditions were that led to this universe, they determined what the universe would be. I'll say, oh, that's great. All right, that's fine. I can accept that. Well, that would still be part of the universe, because the universe is everything that exists. But where did these prior conditions, what determined the conditions of the prior conditions of this universe? And they'd say, I'm not a prior condition, a prior condition. Okay, then what determined these conditions to be the way they are? Okay, that's an even more prior condition, and so on and so on and so forth. It leads to another infinite regress that goes back into the past, which ultimately means we would never get to this point. We would never get to this point of determination, of our reality being determined the way it is. The only way to avoid determinism, a chain of causality, is to argue that at some point, not only was the universe obviously created, but that a choice was made to determine it in a particular manner. Right? Does that make sense? A choice was made to determine that it would be this quantity, this quality, this size, this rate at this moment, or this set of moments. Like it had to be, well, I mean, at this moment, rather, just at this rate, at this level of cosmic laws and rules, to certain proportions and magnitudes that they are the way they are, which the point of science is to measure these things, to find out what these measurements are. But where was this measurement came from? It has to have come from something that chose or proportioned the universe to be the way it was, or whatever was the universe, meaning is everything that exists. So maybe this universe didn't begin with the Big Bang, but existed 6 Big Bangs before that. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, right? Fine. But that initial, there must have been an initial determination of what the size and proportion of things would be that would start this chain reaction going, if there is a chain of determinism. Determinism has to start somewhere, basically, by a determiner. And of course, we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who measured out and determined all things. He measured out and proportioned the creation. He didn't just create it, of course, but he measured it out and proportioned it to a certain level. So with these 4 arguments, which are each based on the 4 possible causes you could ever look into in anything you observe, Aristotle's 4 causes, that all these 4 attributes or aspects of reality prove there has to be a first cause. And guess what? I didn't point to anything specific. I didn't point to the sun, the moon, to the nation of Canada, or the seas or the ocean. I didn't say that what you're seeing is true, and you're not in the matrix. You notice I didn't say that, right? I simply said that whatever you're observing these wherever you're experiencing, whether it's a program or whether it's brain in the vat and you're receiving electrical signals. Even if it was electrical signals, these electrical signals must have had a start point somewhere in the past, a chain of causality that starts somewhere in the past. And hence I argued I put it on Twitter quite provocatively, maybe to some skeptics, that I said, we might not know for certain that what we are observing is an accurate depiction of reality as is, but we know that God is certain. And in fact, God is the only thing we can know for certain. Right? The Creator is actually the only thing we can know for certain. Everything else, we are unable to know or to come to a precise model of how it works. And you might argue, Abdullah, but why would God create us with an inability to know reality? Right? Now, interestingly, the Quran does say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made the universe bil-haq, right? In truth. We're not in this kind of Gnostic or spiritualist world, according to some spiritualists or Gnostics, that believe the world is just an illusion, all right, around you. But the universe was made bil-haq, with truth, right, with reality, from waqiyah, from reality. But regardless of that verse of the Quran, because we haven't got to the Quran just yet, everything has a reality to it. Even if you were in the Matrix, that program that you're observing, if in this hypothetical scenario, comes from some hard drive somewhere, comes from a solid state, memory drive or something, comes from programs generated by something. When you're seeing a computer game and you're seeing the graphics card design, sprites on the screen from you based on the program, that has a reality. There is something happening there. It comes from something. It comes from reality, right? And you could argue that because we can't see the quantum world directly with our eyes, that what you're observing, isn't everything of reality. So whether you're in the Matrix or whether you're in the life that we are observing and so on, we can all agree that you can't observe, or you are not observing all of reality, but you are always observing some aspect of reality, right? As to whether your mental models of reality, are consistent with what's actually happening outside of your mind, that's a different discussion. But everything has a reality to it, actually, everything. Even if you're having a fever and you're seeing illusions, right? Those illusions didn't pop out of nowhere. They come from misfiring synapses in your mind, in your brain, from memories and observation of the world that are all kind of being jammed together. But your illusion is coming from somewhere. Everything you observe has a reality to it, right? And is part of reality in some way, shape, or form. Anyway, so we've got to the point about that there is an infinite thing, or thing that has infinite power, which has a will. How do you know he cares about us? Right? How do you know this creator of the universe cares about us? Well, when people say we're such a small, tiny speck, this creator wouldn't care about us. We're so small and tiny and so on. It's like, well, wait a second. Have you just assumed that this creator that can create from nothing inexhaustibly with intent, so with a purpose behind why it's a choice and intent, knowing and sustaining everything that exists, that this creator has a finite attention span, can't do too many things at once because it's going to be confusing, like a human being, right? The deist has anthropomorphized God into a being with limited attention span. Polytheists have done it too. They say, God's too distant from me to hear my prayers or answer my prayers. So I'm going to pray to an intercessor, like a secretary, one of God's secretaries. I'll pray to this intercessor who will intercede with God because I'm too lowly for God to, hear me, right? It's not like it's not like, God has an infinite capacity to know and to intend things, right? Well, God does have an infinite capacity to intend and know things, and one could argue that if he's sustaining the very subatomic particles in your body right now, out of choice, then how would he not know that you exist, and not know that you exist to an intimate level better than yourself even? right? So the deist assumption is really anthropomorphizing God, and by anthropomorphization, I say that the problem with deists, polytheists, and even atheists, when they try to argue that maybe the universe is eternal and that doesn't need a God, is what they've done is they've given attributes of infinity to finite things. They've mixed infinity and finite stuff together. Right? And in my presentation, I pointed out that Islam is unique. Unique apart from some Unitarian conceptions of Christianity, of some aspects, some conceptions of Judaism, and the types of monotheism in the past. Apart from these things, the uniqueness against these other ideologies and ways of life is that we don't mix the finite and the infinite together, right? We keep them apart, right? And we call this Tawheed. Yeah, is that God does not tire, doesn't have a limited attention span, can't be fooled, or it doesn't have limited attributes or characteristics that we have in any way, shape, or form. So that's just an assumption, an image that we've projected onto God, an assumption that we project onto him. And then that causes these people to have doubts because of this contradiction, and then they reject God and say, no, it's not God that you should have rejected. It's your assumptions you should have rejected, your finite assumptions about God. So deism can't be correct. The only thing that's remaining is that God intended us to exist and has an intention behind our existence. And now to kind of wrap it up, I will say that if everything that exists on this universe, first and foremost, what can we deduce about this, right? What can we say about these things? Well, the Quran says something quite interesting. It says, not equal is something that can't create and something that can create. That can create and that cannot create. Now, the Quran is amazing in many features and ways, but one of its amazing attributes is that it can have one verse that can be a refutation of something, but also a refutation of something else. So that verse, it was a great refutation of people who worship stone statues and idols that can't do anything, can't create. So why are you worshiping? People would, pray to Krishna and then celebrate Krishna's birthday. I'm like, what? Why would you worship something that has a birthday? It doesn't make any sense at all. Why not worship that which created all birthdays? So that didn't make any sense. But this verse of Quran has another interesting, this can be used and to explain something else, which is if God didn't create the universe and never created anything, this would be in a way functionally no different in effect to something that cannot create, right? Something that if God never chose to create anything at all, ever, this would be in effect no different to something that has an inability to create. So then by creating, what is that an evidence of? It's an evidence of the creator's ability to create, to have inexhaustible power, which means that everything in existence is a demonstration of the power of this creator. First and foremost, you almost could say it was our purpose. It is our purpose by intent that we are a demonstration of the power of the creator to create. And it's interesting that the Quran refers to everything that all of Allah's creation as the ayat of Allah, right? And the evidences and signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like if you are, if you're seeing the sun come over the horizon, one of the signs of this is that the sun rising, so to speak, is that the sky will get lighter before you see the sun coming over that horizon. So one of the signs that of this sun coming over the horizon, so one of the evidences that of the sun's existence even is the light. It starts to lighten the horizon as it rises. So the Quran describing the whole universe as the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of the evidence of him, but just as the manifestation of his power. And the fact that everything fundamentally is this in the entire universe means that our purpose must also be that as well, because we are part of this creation, that we are to be signs of Allah's creation. But we are a different creation to rocks and planets and galaxies and so on, which are massive. And interestingly, the Quran does say that the creation of the heavens and the earth are greater than the creation of mankind, but most of mankind know not. That this universe is not meant for us. It wasn't meant to revolve around us. Everything in this universe has its purpose focused on the creator, not on us. When people said, some atheists would argue, or skeptics would say, well, if God made this universe for us, how comes it's bigger than we could ever possibly observe, potentially, or explore? And I said, well, wait a second. Where did you get the assumption that this universe is for you? Right? I mean, sure, Allah has in the Quran it says that He has subjected it to you. As in, it's for your use, what you can use of it, but it's not for you. That's an assumption, as always. If I could be a tiny bit cheeky, I'll relate the story of a lecture I had when I was at university. There was this a bit of a funny, quirky character, and he said, never assume, because, and he takes out the word assume, he writes on the board, he takes the first three letters and he kind of draws a line after the first three letters, and then he draws a line after the letter U, and he says, because it makes out of you and me, right? So no, do not assume. So perhaps that's been emblazoned and kind of imprinted on my psyche, and so now hopefully shall be imprinted upon yours. But if it helps you not to assume, then by all means remember it. Anyhow, so if everything in the universe is a sign of God, and we are a different creation to inanimate matter. I mean, animals have the ability; they appear to be proactively trying to survive and reproduce, like plants, but animals more pronounced, more proactive than plants, not static. They have ability to experience the world, like we have an ability to experience the world, and all these things relate to the creator of the universe. The only thing that could ever potentially explain any of this is that God created consciousness again to bear witness to His power to create everything that exists, and we have free will because that must be connected in some way to bearing testimony to His existence. And now Islam comes along and explains that humans are very complex, like we know. You think that we'd be left with no guidance when we have the ability to have metacognition. We have ability to think, so we can derive concepts and elaborate ideas and cultural structures and rituals and things. You think that we have capacities for intellect, but then we wouldn't be guided on how to use an intellect, and that our guidance wouldn't be related to the creator of everything and on all things, and that we have free will, and you think the free will is just for no purpose at all. But rather, Islam explains that the purpose of free will is that for us to bear witness to God's power, but with free will to do it voluntarily, right? To do it by choice. And imagine also just how amazing free will is. Because you think if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can create everything and He sustains everything, then it's not possible for Him to create something that can reject His guidance or reject His will, right? If His will controls everything, it would be impossible, you'd assume, for Him to create something that could ever defy His will, right? Not possible. And yet, Allah's given us free will, and that itself is a glorification. We call that glorification, we mean an evidence of God's power to create something that could potentially, and does often, say, reject His will and do other than His will. But what is His will when it regards to us? Because you could say the material universe follows just material laws. Well, because we have an intellect, we are given, as well as the material laws that we have to obey, like obviously, we need to eat and so on and so forth, but we are given intellectually based laws that we can come to understand and can allow us to have a choice whether we follow those laws or not follow those laws, not follow those rules. And that would make sense. That actually would be what I expect. And of course, if we need guidance, which is intellectual, then it has to be transmitted to us by a message of some kind. Now, of course, if all this knowledge was given to every human being innately, then you couldn't have free will, because then humans would be imprinted with a law system that they couldn't deny and they would have to follow. So there has to, in order for free will to function, we have to basically be given it in a way that is practical, but also allows the possibility of rejection to facilitate the purpose of free will. And so it has to come via a transmitter of some kind. But if you were to quote unquote see God, quote unquote, you wouldn't have free will, right? If someone puts a gun to your head, you're not going to have free will. It has to be given in the form of a type of plausible deniability for the insincere, right? Plausible deniability for the insincere. And that can only come it has to come by a messenger. Now, it can come by a being that's made for that, let's say an angel or a human. But out of the two, which one would be the best, most optimal messenger for this? Well, to mankind, generally, it'd be better if it came by a human being, because firstly, a human being, you could try to emulate the human being who's manifesting and practicing this message at the same time, right? That's the most optimal way to learn how to follow something, right? A human being has to teach you, and you have to emulate it like you emulate your parents, right? If an angel did it, well, an angel is not human, so it would be kind of impractical you'd view it as, well, it's easy for you to do it as an angel, but I'm not an angel, I can't do this. But also, if you were to see an actual angel, a being that's greater than yourself, according to God, again, that would deny your free will, because you do it out of fear that this greater race of beings could destroy you if you reject it or what have you, which is interesting because the Quran parallels this argument that if angels came to the Quraysh and they had said no, then the judgment would have been immediate, because you would have been given the most absolute proof. I want to say absolute proof. You would have been given like an evidence that even removes insincere deniability to you that God exists. And then if you reject God, then after you're not even having room to maneuver, not even having that insincere deniability, then your judgment is instant, that you're instantly someone shown to be a rejecter of that truth, right? An instant rejecter of that truth. So that it makes sense. I can explain that if you want. I don't want to give too much away from the course. I want to keep it more basic, but the course will go into each of these different points in more depth, but it will actually go into things like human history. It will go into the sciences. It will go into, in this much more depth, each of these points. But long story short, and I can only keep it short because time's ticking, that the only possibility left is that what Islam is saying is true and is the only possibility that explains observable reality. It can only ever be as Islam explained it, as Islam demonstrated it. And the fact that there is nothing like Islam, because like Christianity, we don't have a preserved textual message from the founder of Christianity. Well, Isa alayhi isn't the founder of Christianity. Saint Paul is, but we don't have a guarantee of the authenticity, and there are contradictions in that text. Judaism, same problem, but also it's more parochial to the tribes of Israel, whereas we are expecting a message that has to be more universal to all mankind. But that doesn't necessarily negate the prophets that the Israelites have reported came amongst them. So any human being who comes to this rational deduction would have to conclude there has to be a messenger somewhere, and then go looking for any evidence of this messenger or messengers to find this revelation from God. And this is something that Salman al-Farsi did when he was searching for the truth. He concluded there has to be a messenger somewhere. I'm going to try to find this messenger that is relating to us a clear message from God that's accessible as much as possible. I'll kind of leave it there, but it was initially this led me to concluding that Islam, no matter how deceptively simple it appears, is the only possible explanation for, no, sorry, it was initially the best explanation for reality. And then as I started to do more and more research and gain more and more information and knowledge and all different possibilities and both philosophical and pseudo-scientific speculations, I concluded that it was the only possible explanation. Not just it's the best one of what we've got from all the available religions that we are known to us, but it's actually the only possible explanation that could ever that could explain reality. If you were to change any core doctrine of Islam just a little bit, it would cause a contradiction in its explanation of the universe, everything, and within itself. Of course, someone could argue, well, how do you know there's not 3 salahs or 5 salahs? Was an issue like if there's a religion that had 3 salahs per day or 10 salahs per day. Well, the amount of rituals and things obviously can, you can't rationally say that there can only be a certain number of rituals that people have to do. Of course, it would make sense that you wouldn't get a way of life that asked for so many rituals you couldn't actually do other things in life which you are meant to do, like eat and survive and so on and so forth, of course. Or be, for example, abstinent from marriage, which obviously some religious orders and different monks, both Christian and Buddhist and others, have renounced, let's say sexual pleasures and things like that. They don't want to get married and so on, which wouldn't make sense because we have that as a capacity and a natural drive, a natural as in a God-intended drive in all of us. So that wouldn't make sense. But so you couldn't deduce that Friday has to be the day where there is a congregational prayer. Why not Saturday? Well, at one point it was Saturday, right? But that is not what has to be fixed the way it was. What does have to be fixed the way it was are the very core doctrines, beliefs, and just the general principles, and just how Islam interrelates in society, organizes human nature, family, neighbor, and neighborly obligations and ties, and all these things. That could have only ever been the way it does. Once you have studied human nature, you know that what we experience is this consistency. We call it hikmah, right? We say that this agrees with human fitrah. This Islamic ordinance or command agrees with the human fitrah in organizing society such. That's how we kind of observe it. But if Islam commanded something that goes against the fitrah, then that would be evidence that Islam is not true, because the creator of the fitrah has to be the one that is the author of the revelation that we are receiving. It has to be from the same author. The author of human nature and the universe has to be the same author as the author of revelation. And by comparing it, you'll see that with Islam that it meets and it fits this, and it's what the course is going to demonstrate in more greater detail. I can't do that in this very small lecture. So, barakallah feekum for your patience and kind of listening to myself in this. It did have to go for a little bit more because I wanted to kind of show you. I don't want to make any assertions that just skipped over points in the thinking. I wanted to show you a clear line from complete skepticism to at least the concept that we need a messenger. Right, and then, but now we can do further research, further investigation, and inshallah, my Dawah masterclass course with the Quran Institute will be doing that further investigation in depth and painstaking granular detail. So inshallah, if you want to know more, please sign up to that course. So barakallahu feekum.
Jazakumullah khairan. Thank you so much. Jazakallah khair, Shaykh Abdullah. That was really awesome. Alhamdulillah, very involved. And you were like, oh, this is an introduction. I'm like, oh man, this is like more than an introduction for me. Alhamdulillah. So that's really awesome. And I'm going to share actually the information about your site on the chat, bi'idhnillah ta'ala, so the people can look at that, bi'idhnillah. And I recommend that you sign up for this. But what I really think is an amazing, even if the arguments that you were making are so succinct and so precise, were to involve for the audience, I think the thing that should stand out is that there's a process of reasoning that deduces for us that not just deduces but validates for us our core belief system, right? And that for us is a very important aspect, that our iman, our faith, isn't just based on you're told to do so, so that's it. It's actually based on reasoning. The Quran uses this appeals to reason at every turn. At every turn, there's an appeal to reason, and I'm really glad that you demonstrated to us how that what that looks like, what that process looks like. So Jazakallah khair for that. We actually do have quite a few questions, but we also have the Maghrib Salah right now. I'm using this thing called Slido here. You can I've been posting the QA link. You can ask questions there. What I would suggest, I think I don't want to break the flow of the lecture. Like generally, we would say like let's pause for Maghrib and come back in the masjid, but we're doing things virtually, and I would say that people should like pray their salah and then come back and rejoin if that's okay with everybody, inshallah. What I will do is I will leave this to you, Sheikh Abdullah. You can look through the questions and start to answer them one by one. Is that all right?
Yes, but with only the proviso that you please refer to me as brother. I am
Oh,
no sheikh at all. Closer to a milkshake than a sheikh. Yeah, just call me brother.
we say that because out of respect for how accomplished, mashallah, your presentation is and how you are, mashallah. So I think it is a title well earned, inshallah. But whatever you prefer, bi'idhnillah ta'ala, no problem at all. You can see my questions here, right?
Yes.
Okay, so what I'll do is I'll read the first question, and I'm gonna then just quickly jump off pre-Maghrib, and then I'll be back. I, I'm not. I think maybe if you go on the link that I had posted in the chat, right, you can actually scroll through them as well. Yeah, I think you can, even if you can't check them off. But hopefully by the time I'm back, you're done. Maybe the first few questions, and then we can kind of rapid fire through the rest. Is that all right?
I mean, just so that maybe people who kind of take the time to attend, perhaps we should just have a 10-minute break.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Or however long people would like, and because obviously here it's very late. It's past budget. It's past Maghrib time.
Okay.
And so on, and Isha time even. So for me it's fine, but if you want to give people maybe a 10-minute break, we can reconvene.
Okay.
And I'll be here, inshallah. And
Perfect.
I can answer all those questions.
All right, people, is that okay? Just like type yes if you're okay with that in the chat, please. Maz, where are you? Maz says yes. All right, awesome, great. So we'll take a short break, and I'll put like a small note here that we're taking a small break, bi'idhnillah ta'ala, and refresh ourselves and then finish strong with the QA. Thank you so much. It's actually an excellent suggestion. I really appreciate that. Jazakallahu khairan. We'll be back shortly. What I'll do is I'm going to pause the recording and the live stream will continue. The call will continue as is. Only the thing, and you're free to turn off your video as well if you like, and then I'll share my screen with the note, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. As we're waiting to resume, there is Maz, alhamdulillah. Where is our dear brother Abdullah? Is here as well. I'm going to ask him to unmute, please, and also to start his video. As he's just joining us, alhamdulillah. There's a few questions here that I think I can answer off the top of this discussion, which is that the recording, we are recording this session, alhamdulillah, and we will upload the recording bi'idhnillahi ta'ala to our YouTube channel. Also, the recording or the live stream of this is available on Facebook, so you can actually watch the live stream afterwards there as well. But if you prefer YouTube, inshallah, we will upload it on YouTube as well. Currently, though, we are still going, and you can, even if you missed a part of it, you can still, inshallah, benefit from the rest of it, inshallah. The other things about there was something else here. In fact, let me actually check off a question here. Will this video be posted on the website? Yes, indeed. We will post it on the YouTube page. Okay. Brother Abdullah, are you there?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Alhamdulillah. Jazakallah khairan. I hope you got a little bit more of your energy drink. some more Red Bull in you, inshallah. And then we get going.
I'm injecting it at this point.
All right.
Intravenously, directly.
Oh, Alhamdulillah. Let's do it, bismillah. Okay, so let's go through the questions, inshallah. Jazakallah khair. A common mindset of the older generation is believing what you're told and not asking questions, as doubt may lead to disbelief. What's your take on this?
Well, this was basically a strategy that was adopted as a stopgap measure against roughly perhaps maybe 300 to 400 years ago in the Muslim world, for reasons which I won't go too much into, but basically Islam, the worst thing that ever happened to the Muslim civilization was success. Muslims, when they became very successful, very rich, powerful, and wealthy, when you don't have to think much for where your next meal is coming from, then you don't have to think much. And what you'll see is over many generations, a gradual dumbing down, for want of a better way of putting it, occurred. And with the kind of with the Arabic language itself, becoming kind of corrupted into more Amiya versions, kind of colloquial versions. People were reading Islamic texts and coming up with the wrong ideas, and the scholars started to kind of panic, and for want of a better way of describing it, it was decided that the best way forward is just tell the masses some very simple doctrines that they can absorb and adopt, and kind of make this disconnect between them and the general masses more than had been before. So, like have a very simple Islam that would lead the average Muslim just to kind of live their life and live a simple life in an increasingly complex and more complicated world, which they thought that, that once they had reached this kind of peak of civilization, it became about conserving it as much as possible. And we have it right where we have it now as very comfortable life. So let's just conserve it. And then as kind of living conditions started to be affected by wars and changing economic scenarios, and the West, which had learned our science and technology, discovered the new world and had access to vast quantities of resources, then they kind of soon outstripped the Muslim world, and but Muslims were still thinking they were the superior civilization, and they started to think that it became a kind of arrogance as opposed to the humility of, well, look, we have to spread a message, and we have a world project for Islam, and we're only as good as our intentions and our endeavors and our efforts, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not going to make life easy for us in the sense of, we won't be needing to use our intellect, which He gave us to use, right? We'll just, things just too simple. We'll just approach it simply. So what you saw from many Westerners who went to the Muslim world, they tend to describe it in a very amazing terms. They say it's decadent. The Muslim world is decadent, right? Much like you'd say that people from Muslim countries go to America and would say maybe the United States of America is because I know that America also has Canada and Mexico, and then Central America and South America. Anyway, so they'd go there and say that's very decadent culture that they're following. Likewise, the Westerners who were traveling to the Muslim world were looking at Muslims and saying, very decadent culture. And as industry and economics kind of started to suffer, because Muslims were relying on trade routes, taxing trade routes and making, money off a global economic system that they were right in the middle of. And so they didn't, they could live the easy life. And what happened is that when Europe learned to circumvent that or go to the New World, and then the trade routes weren't as lucrative as they were before, the living conditions started to descend or to decrease. And what you see, if you see these old paintings mostly by Europeans, when they go to the Muslim world, is you see that these very richly dressed Muslims, right, very nice, ornately dressed Muslims, but they're in these kind of buildings which look like they're descending into rubble around them, things like that, right? You're like, well, wait a second, that seems a bit weird. What's going on there, right? And that's in essence what was happening, was that as Muslims started to lose more, they just made do with what they had, or they tried to adapt by just accepting less and less, because it would go by increments, right? It was almost imperceptible. Anyway, that's what was generally happening in an economic situation, but in the intellectual situation in the Muslim world, because Muslims had for centuries thought that they were obviously the top of the world, the superior civilization, and that didn't require to do anything because they were just blessed by God, and God would always give blessings to the Muslims, or giving them izzah no matter what, just because they say they're Muslim, right? Without having to do anything or to live by principles, So then, Muslims would do things going against the Sharia, like they would go on raids of European lands and cities, and obviously African and all around the world. Some of them would go on raids and then just take prisoners and put them into servitude. But the laws of jihad specify that that's only when you're basically fighting to kind of spread Islam by conquering enemy military, which are acting as obstacles for the dawah from a regime that's, let's say, being tyrannical or what have you. You fight the military, and it's those who are fighting you, which you can choose to take them as prisoners of war and then make them work, as the third Geneva Convention allows, by the way. But Muslims were like, no, we're just going to do raids because non-Muslims owe us this. They owe us, they are subservient to us, which is not the Islamic thinking, right? And it was arrogance, right? So it was arrogance, and then a gradual kind of stupefaction that was happening. So the dwindling capable Islamic scholars, the dwindling numbers of capable Islamic scholars, perhaps started to panic at this scenario happening. The Arabic language becoming, kind of falling into different dialects and not being as robust as it once was in the mind of the Muslims. So they tried to basically just give simple codified doctrines and beliefs for Muslims, simple ones. So that just believe in this book, because if you start reading the texts with your inferior knowledge of Arabic or your Amiya version of Arabic, your kind of colloquial Arabic, you're going to get the wrong ideas, and we want to stop people coming up with random heretical ideas. So over time, this built up to this kind of dogmatic, and by dogmatic I mean like a checklist version of Islam that you see taught to Muslims today. And of course, then when colonialism happened, which is a second calamity, where the kind of foreign colonialists shaved off the top layer of Islamic education, stopped funding madrasas, stopped funding scholars, of course, places of teaching, and then started teaching Western education. And okay, the sciences and mathematics, that's great. We were doing that before they did. They were teaching us, but then teaching Western philosophy, literature, cultural history, to the point then that all that remained was the kind of low-level Quran tutor who, in essence, just taught people rote learning of the Quran, just to memorize, and then it just became memorization, just memorizing the form of it, not necessarily the meaning of it, right? And you have some brilliant, beautiful reciters, for example, from Pakistan, right? But they don't know what they're reciting, even though amazing reciters. And it was interesting because I know this numerous situations where you have an Arabic brother speaking to a Pakistani brother, and the Pakistani brother's like recitation is beautiful. The Arab guy's like saying, "I wish I could recite the Quran like that, but do you know what you're saying?" And the guy goes, "No, I don't." And but had some inkling of it, but not the actual understanding of that an Arabic speaker would have in comparison. So long story short, all this led to is that in the Muslim world, if you're a Islamic scholar, you're viewed now as backward because Western education system pushed out Islamic sciences from being taught, and so you're viewed that if you're someone who's intellectual and clever and knows stuff, you went through the Western education system that was provided and of which everything now is a successor to, and you become an accountant, engineer, and so on and so forth. But if you fail all of that, don't worry, because if you're intellectually challenged and you can't do these things, don't worry, you'll still have the opportunity just to study Islamic sciences and get some respect in that society. And people look down upon Islamic scholars in the Muslim world, or alims, or mullahs, or mulvis, or whatever they say, even in a derogatory tone, how they say those words. And that's the situation today. So in a nutshell, anyway, one could argue that Ibn Khaldun kind of predicted that would happen, right, through a kind of cyclical nature of civilizations. But it took 1,000 years for Islam to, for this level of decadence and kind of stupefaction occurring, leading to this. So it took 1,000 years before you had this descent down. Whereas in the West, since its Renaissance in the 12th century, in the 13th century, is only 800 years into from its Renaissance. So, and look, it's already declining intellectually and so on and so forth, right? So things are turning, and that's just the way of civilizations, I suppose. Anyway, I hope that answers that. That the previous generation, our grandfathers and so on and so forth. I mean, like, mashallah, there's some great characters amongst them, very principled people amongst them, but most of them were taught an Islam that was just a checklist which you do along with your life, and not being the basis of your life. And that's, to put a long story short, I think the reason for why we have that situation in Muslim world as it is today.
That's a really fascinating answer. Jazakallah khair. Very expansive in its scope, and mashallah, I really appreciate that. One interesting thing also is that I think Islam becomes just a checklist. It's just boiled down to a checklist. Okay, eat the halal meat, fast in Ramadan, check. Pray on this time, check. Put your hands here in salah, check. And then the iman, which is the way you view the world, it just gets lost, unfortunately. So that is a calamity. But thank you for contextualizing that for us.
If I may, maybe something that would, just a small tiny point, which was, you'll notice this when this discussion is on Muslims having doubts or shubha about Islam. And the solution almost always hear, is that they should have learned better about Aqidah. They should have read these Aqidah books, and that would have helped them. But a Muslim learning about, for example, one of the articles of faith they have to be, or the branches of furu' is, let's say, belief in punishment of the grave, isn't going to prevent them from having doubts about God's existence or the messengership of the Prophet Muhammad. No matter how, whether you read Aqidah Tawhawiyah or or any kind of like a Hanafi manual or Shafi manual. Well, that's usually your fiqh, but that's not going to stop you from having these doubts unless you have a foundation for your belief based on, as the Quran advises, obviously observing and coming to a conclusion about the world. Anyway, that was my...
That's awesome. Barakallahu feek. Still struggling to understand how we can base these initial assertions on observation when someone can easily respond, what if we are living in a simulation?
So I think I already answered that. I said that in my discussion, I I didn't refer to any particular objects. I mean, I use an example of a stone, let's say, but even if you were in a simulation, the simulation comes from somewhere, and you're certainly living in a world of components, right? You're not living in a world where everything is the same thing, or there's only one reality, some type of wahdat al-wujud concept by some people. Because if that was the case, then where is the multiplicity of things coming from, right? Even if you're in a program, there's the fact that there's multiplicity, and each individual thing is finite, regardless of whether it's generated from a computer simulation based on code, or it comes from a amalgamation of quantum particles. The effect is the same. So I said I pointed to 4 fundamental aspects of reality, which is finitude, it being a specific size, what have you, it being made of something, and change. Those things are always going to be there no matter what you're observing. So you don't need to know what you're observing is an accurately represents the model of the universe that you imagine, the model of what is outside your mind. That's irrelevant. Those 4 things are always going to be universal aspects of creation, whatever it is you're observing in creation. And from those 4 aspects, you can prove there's an ultimate creator and sustainer and determiner and specifier behind all things.
Amazing. If everything we observe is in our brain, in brackets not real, then how do we even trust its components, attributes, change, specificity, substance, etc.? I was able to pronounce that word okay.
I think that's exactly this. It's the same thing again, which is
same. I think answer. You just answered that one, right?
Same.
Alhamdulillah.
Someone actually on Twitter, I'm going to add this. They made a better argument. They said, "You're doing all this rationality based on your brain. How do you know that your brain is working accurately and not producing, incorrect results and so on and so forth?"
Yeah.
So my point is that your brain, you only know of your brain due to observation of like other people's brains or your MRI scan of your brain or what have you, right? You only know that you have a brain by observation.
Yep.
But to get to that, you have to trust your senses, right? To tell you that you have a brain and the brain can malfunction. So what comes first before anything is experience, as in there's something inside you that's experiencing the world, right? That's the observer inside you. So the observer can make these conclusions, definitely. But to believe that a brain can malfunction, you have to first believe in the brain, and that comes from trusting your senses. So that is a shorter way of answering that. There is a longer way, but I'll go through those permutations in the course, all the different permutations. But yeah, that's
can you even say? Oh yeah. So can you even say that? Like I'm not just thinking out loud here as you answered that. Was that like in Islam, one of the things that's required for a person to be what's called mukallaf, liable for their actions in the sight of God, is that they have to be of sound mind, right? So the assumption in Islam is that you have a sound mind, and thus this process is then kickstarted from there. But if a person is, limited capacity in terms of their brain capacity is limited, they're actually not held liable by God for trying to for the responsibility of discovering the truth. What would you have to say to that?
Of course, I mean, being mukallaf is always going to be a prerequisite, and if your brain is defective, then and your thinking process is defective, then you can be more rest assured that you won't be accountable for what you do or say anyhow, and that's out of your control. So it would be irrelevant. But what you can do is, from what you can deduce, you must choose the best conclusions for what is available to you.
Yeah. There's a question here. I was just actually loading up the ayah that the question is referring to. It is said that while mountains refused, humans accepted the heavy duties. How does it become my responsibility, as I was never asked? And this is for the benefit of the audience. This is referring to this verse of the Quran, surah number 33, verse 72. That inna عرضنا الأمانة على السماوات والأرض والجبال فأبين أن يحملنها وأشفقنا منها وحملها الإنسان إنه كان ظلوما جهولا. We offered the trust to the heavens and the earth and the mountains, but they refused to bear it because they were afraid of it. But man bore it, he surely proved unjust and ignorant. So the question, I guess, is about this ayah, if I'm not mistaken. Is that your also understanding is also, Brother Abdullah?
Yes. So all of Adam's alayhi salam's progeny was kind of brought out, so to speak, from him. So we were all brought out and asked if we would consent, as you say, to accept this, and we accepted willfully and kind of wantonly. And the Quran describes it that we were kind of that man is unjust to was unjust to himself, right? Because we put this test upon us, which many of us are going to fail, and we decided we wanted to have this test because we wanted to get the kind of the possible benefits from this. So it was because we, in essence, were greedy almost for this amana, for the privileges that come with this amana. That we actually did ourselves collectively speaking, from a proportion of humanity, we did ourselves a disservice and an injustice to ourselves by jumping on something without understanding that perhaps not understanding, but without recognizing perhaps the full weight of what that might entail. But we were greedy for the trust to take the privilege. But as everything in Islam, with every privilege comes responsibility. Right? So with every trust comes, every responsibility comes, and trust comes, and privilege. They are all connected together. So everything is balanced out. So the inanimate matter in the universe, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could make, obviously, that matter conscious to ask itself, to ask of it. It said no, it doesn't want it. Then all it has to look forward to is just existing, and then it will maybe cease to exist, and that's it. But it didn't have any further desires beyond that, and it doesn't. That's it. But us, we wanted that extra, right, beyond normal matter, and if that's the case, then we extra will be expected of us.
Like we wanted that consciousness. We enjoy the privileges of having a consciousness, a will, a free will, and that comes with the responsibility of the amana, of bearing the responsibility of finding the truth and then worshiping the truth. Right? Is that a fair summary, Brother Abdullah?
Yeah, and as it says, the Quran uses the kind of the term for dhulm, right? It means injustice, and that's what we did. And that we were also jahil in how we reacted, ignorant. So we didn't think through the consequences of this, and we actually did ourselves, collectively speaking, an injustice.
Now, I don't want to belabor the point here, but I think it seems the questioner is referring to, like I didn't choose it, like me as Arij, right? So how come I have to do it, right? What would you say to something like that?
Well, I'd say that we all chose it. We just don't remember it, right? So we acceded to do the test, but people might say, well, why should I bear responsibility for something I don't remember? But people do it all the time. Someone comes up to you and says, look, you lent me, I lent you $20. And it's like, well, I don't remember that. And then they show you some text message or something. Say, look, here you go. It was about a year ago, but here you go. You actually did it. And you verify and you go, okay, I have to honor it then, because there's a point where I willingly accepted it, even if I don't remember you lending me that money. So just because you don't remember it, and I remember insan comes from the root nisyan, meaning forgetful. Right, then we have to now honor that pledge, even if you don't remember it.
Okay, Jazakallah khairan. Let's move on to the next one, which is, why can't God be imperfect, and how do we define perfection/imperfection?
Okay, I was actually going to say something else about a previous point, just to kind of hammer it home, which was I forgot it. That will come to me. Anyway, I'll probably come to me in a second. So, how do we? Well, you can say, how can God be imperfect? Well, we have to. Christians like to use this term a lot, right? Perfection, or they say greatest conceivable being. Okay, that if that means infinite, I can understand that. But when they try to use attributes of goodness, right? They say, "Oh, God is good," but what do you define by that, right? Well, like how are you defining this? And some Muslims have adopted these kind of terminologies with their Christian meanings, and it's produced confusion. So perfection in English language, and I suppose in both Greek and in Arabic, is related to completeness. So something is complete, it's not incomplete. Okay, so if you were going to make a car, you make it perfect according to its standard, as in according to its template. That means you make something and it agrees 100% with what you intended to make it, so it's perfect by that measure. But then if you want to say, is it perfect in a more general sense, like is it lacking of anything, right? And that depends how you define. So I would say that all finite things, limited things, created things, they're imperfect by definition of them lacking, as in they can't sustain themselves, and their powers and abilities only go up to a certain extent and not beyond that. So God, which is inexhaustible in power, by definition can't lack anything. And so if imperfection is defined as lacking, then again, by definition, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who has an inexhaustible power, is lacking nothing.
Jazakallah khair. If infinity isn't in the physical world, how come the number pi is infinite? Pi is defined as the circle's circumference, physical, and its diameter also physical.
Well, I don't know why people use the example of pi. I mean, I could just use the example 1 divided by 3. I don't know why that's not as
popular.
It's more simpler to use as an example, because it produces 0.333 recurring, right? Now, all that demonstrates is that the human model of measuring or counting, its counting system and balancing equations is unable to meet the requirements of the real world, or at least of abstract concepts. But in the real world, pi, if you were measuring a line, I mean, certainly in the real world, it doesn't go into infinity. Nothing goes into infinity. It will go down to the smallest atom, and then if you want to go beyond, then the smallest particle, and then to possibly Planck space, the smallest possible measurable space that can be conceived of in physics. This reminds me of Aristotle's argument against Zeno's paradoxes, where he argued that Zeno was saying that everything in reality is divisible infinitely, and he uses to argue that to show that reality is an illusion, that to actually argue against the senses, so that how can anything move when it has to cross an infinite amount of points, right? So that became a school of thought in Greece, the idea that observable reality is an illusion, whereas actually in the real world, we'd argue that, and physicists would certainly argue that, well, maybe reality is actually broken down to only a finite level, and like in a computer screen, you have pixels, and as things move by, the pixels changing, but you can divide it to the smallest possible is the pixel, and that allows things, processes to make calculations and to position things in different places, based, or at least by the graphics card, by pixels being the most fundamental unit of measurement on a computer screen, for example. So basically, in that sense, there is nothing infinite. There's no real infinitesimal. All there is that the concept of pi cannot be represented in human mathematics, and 1 divided by 3. Although you could argue it has been, because 1 divided by 3 would represent it, but you can't do that in the decimal system.
I think the reason why pi is brought up is because pi is an irrational number, right? 1 by 3 is a rational number, right? But you're right.
Yeah, that's what they call it, irrational numbers. It's quite fun.
But it's something, because the like in regression series, right? Like the or infinite series in algebra, right? They're labeled as infinite because like you can't put a value on n. You can always say, okay, n is whatever number, you add 1 to it. That's the point. It's just a mathematical representation. It's not to say that there is like a limitless amount of things in the world, or the circle is like of limitless circumference, for example, right?
I mean, well, exactly. So, kind of just to break it down for the specific example. So I used 1 divided by 3, but okay, if you want to discuss pi, then so the circumference divided by the diameter. The diameter is a finite amount of measurement that can be, kind of zoomed in, if you will, to the atoms and to subatomic particles, and then to eventually Planck space, and likewise circumference too can be measured down to the smallest unit, because there is movement in this universe, and so things have to move from one point to another, and they can't be infinitesimal points between them. Although people say mathematically there are infinitesimal points. I say, well, no, mathematics didn't say there are infinitesimal points. Mathematics just doesn't prevent you from, on paper or on a processor, dividing a figure by another figure, and as long as you can keep doing that, you can just keep dividing it. Yeah. As long as you can keep doing that, as long as a processor can keep doing that, that makes any sense, right? Yeah. But that's all it is. So the people say the number line is infinite, right? I say the number line doesn't exist, right? You have the amount of numbers that have been measured by conceived of by human beings to that, like the highest possible number. Is it like a zentillion or something? I forgot the most recent one. The highest one they've conceived of naming, or deducing how many zeros are in it, like 1 to the power of how many zeros on exponent. But there's no number line. There's just a counting rule, a decimal counting rule for the decimal system, which is from 1 to 9, then replace with a 0 and add a number, add a number next to on the left of it, and then continue. And that's all it is. That's decimal. It's just a counting rule. I sometimes like to joke that there's no infinite numbers. There's only 10 figures, right? And then the ability to arrange those figures as long as you want to, as much as you want to arrange them, and add to and duplicate them. And that's it. So it's just a counting rule. There's no number line, actually.
Yeah. But even going against God's will, God's will is within his mighty will and knowledge. So it's not against his will. I'm not sure if that's a question, or do you understand?
No. Yes. So when I pointed out that it was like it was an amazing feat that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could create something that could go against his will. And they said, well, surely if people are doing what he allows them to do, then surely they're going with his will, right? So surely it was Allah's will that Iblis would reject reject God's command to humble himself in front of Adam alayhi salam and lead to what happened. For example, now here's the thing. It depends what you're going to define as will. So if you say that God's intent, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's intent for something, so Allah intends you to do something, and then you think, well, if he intends to do something, then surely it will happen. But God intends, if you mean by will that God intends you to make a choice, and then God gives permission to bring about that choice, so then and intends for you to go against the will that he's expressed for that thing that has free will, then in essence he has both achieved something going against his will, and yet not going against his will at the same time, without it being a contradiction, which requires some reflection upon. But to give a better way of putting it, to make it more simpler, when you mean that God wills something, it means that basically he orders something and then it happens. Okay. But then he orders Iblis, or orders the wayward amongst us, or even just the average sinner, to do a particular thing. So he intends for us to know of his will, to then obey it, and then we choose to disobey. And what God has done is given permission to disobey. So it's not that. So he's given us an order not for us to intend to disobey it, but he gives us permission to disobey it.
Yeah.
Right? And for those who do disobey it, he brings about their disobedience, as in his permission means that he allows the disobedience to manifest and so on. So in a broader sense, everything is according to his will, of course, because he knows that Iblis is going to disobey him and he permits it. So in that sense, yes. But in the sense of he gives a command and the thing that is being commanded chooses to not obey that command. And God tends to give the command with the intent for us to obey that command. Means that that's how we can that's how he's able to make something that can go against his will. But because we're all dependent on God, in a broader sense, nothing can go against his will. So it's not a contradiction, because one case it's will being defined as an intent to give a command with intent for that thing to obey, and that's what God intends. And another way, it's God's permitting the disobedience against his will, which, if you want to say that's also his will, yes, but at the same time, he did allow or intend for them to allow someone to disobey and reject his stated will, his command.
So that's really nicely. That's a great way of putting it. Alhamdulillah. Last question here. There was one that I think was like the whole topic. How do we know Islam is the truth? That was the topic of the lecture. Alhamdulillah. But lastly, I think we'll conclude with this question, inshallah. Is there something wrong with living a life that, I guess, focuses on maximizing pleasure? Like the intent of that person's life is, you know what? Yes, this and that, but my goal is to maximize my pleasure. How would you answer this question?
Okay, well, there's a number of ways. One, if the intent in life was for everyone to maximize pleasure, then there wouldn't be any pain. If our purpose of life was pleasure, there wouldn't be suffering and pain existing in the universe. Some people assume that God made us to experience pleasure and just pursue pleasure. And then when there is suffering, they say, "Oh, how can there be a God?" Say, no, you made the assumption that your purpose in life was seeking pleasure. Where if you saw suffering, that was an evidence, not that God doesn't exist, it's an evidence that your assumption's wrong, right? That we have both pain and pleasure in life, right? And so what this points to us is that there's a purpose which is higher than that, higher than pain and pleasure, but pain and pleasure are components in that purpose. They are part of and fitted into this purpose. They are involved in our purpose. If you want to seek a life, kind of maximizing pleasure, people often assume, this in a very liberal, innocuous way. Oh, I'm just enjoying myself and not hurting anybody. But remember, right, for someone who is, who may be someone who enjoys gratuitously committing rape, committing murder, fighting for nationalism, in essence, justifying murder in those situations, or many other heinous crimes, pedophilia or what have you, with like 4 or 5 year olds, which happens quite often in the West, and so on, is prolific to the point that now it's a big focus on in Western society because of its prevalence. A pedophile or a rapist, a gratuitous rapist, or certainly a psychopath or a sadist rather, who enjoys torturing people, would say they're just maximizing pleasure, and there's nothing you could argue against it. And the reason why you would agree with these examples that, okay, these things are wrong, is because obviously we've all adopted and assumed the basis that harming people in what those activities involve is wrong. Now the question is more fundamentally, why is it wrong? Why are they wrong? The animal kingdom doesn't seem to care about cannibalism, doesn't seem to care about pedophilia or rape or what have you. Animals doing it all the time in various different species. Some species of spider only reproduce by what you would call rape, although some people could argue that spiders can't give consent. But then again, no animal can give consent, and so all animal reproduction then would be rape by that definition, because no animal can give consent if then they're not with the capacity of the human intellect, right? Surely, right? So anyway, my point is this: what makes right and wrong, right? What makes good and bad? The good and bad can't be deduced or rationalized as words in themselves. We have no further reference point unless it's in reference to a purpose. And I always give this example. I say, what makes a good car? I ask people, what makes a good car? Okay, so I ask him, would a car that has wheels and engine, it can drive from A to B, is that a good car? And they say, well, okay, yeah, more or less. Although Teslas are better. And then you say, okay, what makes a bad car, right? And they say, okay, well, would they at least agree that a car that doesn't have wheels, no engine, no steering wheel, no windows, nothing, that's a bad car at the very least. And so they say, yeah, okay, I can agree to that. Why? Why is it a bad car? Why does the car has no wheels, no engine, no windows or anything, presumably in a cold environment? Why is that a bad car? And they'll say, well, because, you get a car for the purpose of traveling from A to B. If the car can't fulfill that purpose, it's bad. And if a car can fulfill that purpose, then of course it would be good. So, okay, then our purpose, or rather good and bad, can only be judged by our purpose as conscious beings that experience the world, as those that bear witness to the Creator, bear witness to God by our actions of choosing God over lesser causalities in the world, like which our heart might be moved towards, but choosing the highest causality, which is the Creator of the universe, over the lower causalities. Surely that would be our definition of good, because it's fulfilling our purpose of bearing witness to God, because you have consciousness and therefore you're witnessing the world, and the world it was made by the Creator. The Creator is the crux of everything, and therefore behind everything, and therefore our fundamental purpose is to bear witness to the Creator, which is what the Quran says, and we do so by following the natural law, so to speak, for human beings. Everything in the universe has a natural law that it follows. What's our natural law? Right? What do we do? Right? And that can only be given to us because we have intellect. It has to be given to us in an intellectualized form of rules and guidelines. And following those rules and guidelines are now our measure of good and bad, basically. So that's how you judge good and bad. So why is maximizing pleasure? Why can't we just maximize pleasure? Because A, it's just not our purpose. B, it's meaningless because it is not our purpose. And C, if you, let's say, going to take another worldview or deen, let's say liberalism, it couldn't really justify why you can't maximize pleasure by doing things that would contradict its other aspects of liberalism, such as, the people's right to consent and prevention of harm. If the purest purpose was just a maximization of pleasure, because surely a person who, let's say, is a pedophile and only likes 4-year-olds, let's just say, right, would feel that they are repressing themselves if they had to, restrain themselves from doing so. Or a sadistic rapist or a sadistic murderer, they feel they are repressing themselves, repressing their desires in order to fulfill some higher, moral imperative. And they're not fulfilling they're not maximizing their pleasure. So anyway, that's the point, that there's just no purpose or meaning behind anything other than the Creator. And that, in a nutshell, would be the answer to that.
Alhamdulillah. Jazakallah khair, Brother Abdullah. That was, mashallah, really a fantastic presentation, and how you weave together these things, mashallah, in such a beautiful manner. It's really inspiring. Very, very, we're very thankful, very grateful that you shared your time with us and shared your expertise with us. Jazakallahu khairan. I want to share with the people quickly the class you're teaching, the course you're teaching. This is the Quran.institute/masterclass. This is the website for it. Is that correct? Right? That's the one, right? That's the one, right? Okay, alhamdulillah. So that is something I would encourage all of you to look into and read more. Also, the website of our dear brother has articles and his publications and video lectures if you'd like to keep up with what he's doing. So that is something that is really, really nice. Inshallah, I encourage you to check it out. Thank you very much, Brother Abdullah. Jazakallah khair. Inshallah, we'll conclude with that. That's his website, alhamdulillah. And we will take we'll continue on with this with this series going forward. But again, I encourage you to follow our brother and benefit from him even after this is done. Barakallahu fikum. Inshallah ta'ala, we'll see you all soon. Thank you again, Brother Abdullah. If we'll conclude with this now, inshallah. We're about to come close to Isha as well. I know it's late in your neck of the woods as well, alhamdulillah. So we really, really thank you for that. If you have any concluding words, you can please make them now, and then we'll end with that, inshallah.
Okay, well, firstly, barakallahu feekum, Sheikh, for inviting me and everybody for patiently kind of listening in to the very end and asking your questions. As I said, even everything that I've told you, please do not just take it blindly as well, because that'd be defeating the purpose of all this. Please investigate, question, and challenge and try to refute it. And maybe not maybe, definitely I learn things all the time from people challenging